Don't lie. You're going after the gold. I read Otis's emails.
There's a reason Spike Lee collaborated with Netflix to create Da 5 Bloods, and that's because other studios turned him down. His limited budget may have accounted for one particular editing choice, but that doesn't mean this movie is not worth watching. Quite the contrary, it tells a side of a story rarely included in war movies, and is surprisingly relevant to modern times despite taking place years ago. Spike Lee set out to tell an authentic story about the Vietnam War from a perspective that's frankly underrepresented. To put it simply, Da 5 Bloods is about 4 African-American veterans who served in the Vietnam War and returned to the country in order to find the remains of their former squad. But of course, you know there's gotta be a hitch, and the hitch is, his remains is buried amongst gold. Of course they want to pay their respects, but they're also understandably hoping for a one-eyed Willie from the Goonies final resting place situation. While the film is about their modern-day search, we also get to see flashbacks of their experience during the war. Instead of choosing different actors to portray younger versions of the veterans, or trying to de-age them digitally with special effects, Spike Lee opted to simply have them play themselves for one big reason. He couldn't afford to do it any other way. And I mean that, literally. Now, don't get me wrong, Netflix was generous when it came to funding the project, which, by the way, was estimated to have a budget of $35 to $45 million. To put that into perspective, the Academy Award-winning La La Land had a $30 million budget, and Da 5 Bloods is one of Lee's most expensive films so far. The director told the New York Times he wasn't getting $100 million to de-age our guys, which was a reference to the alleged $160 million budget for another film distributed by Netflix, The Irishman. Even though the decision to de-age the veterans may have come down to budget, Lee thinks the film is all the better for it, because there's one thing you just can't add to a movie no matter how much CGI you throw at it: their memory. Lee says he was able to turn a negative into a positive, and that the characters' appearances color recollections of their former selves when they remember past events. Plus, there's the fact that digital de-aging almost always looks creepy and unnatural to some extent. Just because we have the technology doesn't mean we have to cram it into every movie and make real actors look like something from the uncanny valley. And just because there's no de-aging doesn't mean there aren't some visual aspects of the movie we can get excited about. If you've seen Wes Anderson's The Grand Budapest Hotel, then you know how much can be accomplished with purposeful color schemes and aspect ratio alterations to highlight differences between locations and time periods. According to Da 5 Bloods cinematographer Newton Thomas Siegel, they shot the film in 4 distinct formats, and he also cited the classic Lawrence of Arabia as one of his inspirations for the film's epic cinematography. Siegel claims that Lee wanted to focus on the story of the veterans and their interactions with each other, so he tried to include as many of them on the screen at one time as possible, even if that meant playing with the aspect ratio a little bit. This turned out great in the finished version of the film, but Siegel admits that it was often a nerve-wracking process, especially since they only had actor Chadwick Boseman as Norman for 2 weeks in Thailand, far from their film lab. The crew basically had to cross their fingers and rely on their expertise and experience, and it ended up paying off in the final version of the movie. But there's an even more important perspective in Da 5 Bloods that has nothing to do with aspect ratios. I'm talking about the perspective of African-American veterans, which is sadly underrepresented. Spike Lee was adamant about telling their stories about what they experienced on the battlefield and what life was like once they returned home. I had the privilege and honor to show this film, 4 screenings, to Black and Puerto Rican Vietnam vets, and they loved it. Vietnam veteran Larry Doggett said that while Black soldiers fought to defend America, they got very little recognition for it, and even less support from the government when they returned home. Back in 1967, Black Americans made up about 11% of the population, but 16.3% of soldiers who were drafted, and 23% of Vietnam combat troops overall. Doggett claims that many Black Americans were forced to choose between hard work for little pay, or joining the military and having the chance to fight for their country and hopefully better lives for themselves. Getting this film made wasn't easy, even for an accomplished director like Spike Lee. Maybe he was so cool about his lack of de-aging budget because he admits that all the other studios turned him down. Although he did say Netflix was great to work with, filming in Thailand and Vietnam weren't easy, especially when temperatures reached the triple digits in the jungle. In addition to his camera team, Lee also had a military advisor who had served in Vietnam on hand to help set things just right. Let's be real, there are tons of war movies out there. 1917 came out in 2019, hit it big at the box office and won 3 Academy Awards. The movie actually had a multiracial supporting cast, portraying British soldiers in the trenches, despite the fact that ethnicity wasn't recorded in recruitment papers in World War I, so it's hard to know what the actual numbers were. Speaking of numbers, the movie was really about two main characters on a mission to save 1,600 men who were operating on some bad intel, but that really doesn't jive with the scale of the overall conflict, and military historian Jeremy Banning also cited some strategic inaccuracies in the film. There may be a lot of war movies, but historically accurate ones are hard to find. One of the most famous, or should I say infamous, was the Green Berets with John Wayne. Like Da 5 Bloods, it's about the Vietnam War, but, well, that's pretty much where all the similarities end. The Pentagon allowed the crew use of their props and bases, but in exchange for letting them have final say on the script. The end result was a notoriously inaccurate piece of propaganda released during the Tet Offensive and made in order to show support for the military. A more recent movie about the Vietnam War is The Last Full Measure, which was overseen by Air Force Senior Master Sergeant John Pigney. Apparently, pointing out historical inaccuracies in films is kind of his thing, and he wanted to make sure everything in this movie was the way it should be. He called out 1988's Bat-21 for showing soldiers with torn sleeves and red bandanas, which he insists wasn't a real thing, but The Last Full Measure used the wrong helicopters, because the right ones were too rare and difficult to transport. There's also Danger Close, The Battle of Long Tan, which got overall good reviews from critics but not nearly as glowing reviews from veterans. Director Kriv Stenders admitted that veteran Harry Smith, who was a commander during the battle, and his fellow vets had some issues with inaccuracies in the film. The movie showed a personal carrier unit rescuing them, when they said it had merely arrived to provide reinforcement. Little things like showing soldiers without helmets and depicting them using pistols instead of rifles were also pointed out as inaccuracies glaring to the people who had actually been there. Small details are important when you're creating a piece of historical fiction, but let's take a look at the bigger picture here. Even if The Last Full Measure had splurged on a Command HH-43 Husky, it still wouldn't have told the story Da 5 Bloods does, one Spike Lee claims is rarely ever touched on in such films. Veteran Richard D. Kingsbury is a commander of the National Association for Black Veterans, and he hopes movies like Da 5 Bloods helps people recognize the sacrifices made by black soldiers, both during the war and afterwards. He believes that we need more stories of African Americans that served in that era, and this movie is a good start. Accurately representing historical events is important, but Da 5 Bloods doesn't just give us a glimpse at the past, it also connects with current historical events. According to Spike Lee, this wasn't intentional, since he's been trying to get the film made for quite some time, but he said it's the crazy world we live in and the stars just aligned. Lee recalls seeing both pro and anti-war sentiment on television, and he can't help compare it to the world we live in today. He said, "What I remember in the 60s when we grew up, that's what I'm seeing right now in the streets." The major reason Spike Lee wanted to make this movie in the first place was to show, well, that Black Lives Matter, that they mattered during the Vietnam War, and once those soldiers returned home. So it's not hard to see parallels between Lee's vision and the current Black Lives Matter movement. Many people had moral opposition to the Vietnam War, including Martin Luther King Jr., who said that it was an immoral war, the same way Muhammad Ali said. Movies like The Green Berets showed the conflict as justified, which is hardly surprising considering the Pentagon was in charge of editing the script. Even The Last Full Measure is focused on an individual soldier's heroics without examining the larger scope of the war itself, or the society which sent out these soldiers and welcomed them home afterwards. But Da 5 Bloods doesn't shy away from the realities of the situation, especially as it related to black soldiers. They fought for a country which had only deemed segregated schools unconstitutional a year before the war began, and the first student to integrate, Rudy Bridges, is only 65 years old. This film feels so relevant despite its historical nature that it really couldn't have been released at a better time, but that was not on purpose. This script was written all the way back in 2013 by Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo, and was supposed to be called The Last Tour. Spike Lee and Kelvin Wilmot were attached to the project since 2016 after Oliver Stone dropped out as director, and they stepped up to write it from an African-American perspective. Filming started in March 2019, and it was originally going to debut at the 2020 Cannes Film Festival in May, but that's been scrapped due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I'm not going to spoil Da 5 Bloods in case you haven't seen it, but I will speak on one specific scene, so if you're a purist, you may want to skip ahead here. There's a very brief scene in which a donation is made to Black Lives Matter, a scene which could come straight from present day rather than the year prior when it was filmed. We might find this surprising, but you know who doesn't? Spike Lee. He said, "I mean, the last time New York had a curfew was 1943. You know what the reason was?" What do you think about Spike Lee's Da 5 Bloods? Is it painfully relevant or already outdated? Let us know what you think in the comments section and learn more about the latest movies by clicking on the subscribe button and turning on your notifications to stay up to date with us here at ScreenRant. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next time.